A new nation dramatically emerged on the world map in the 15th century, the United States of America. This marked an unprecedented historical event, as it was the very first time a former colony successfully secured its independence. Our journey begins in 1492, when the explorer Christopher Columbus famously unveiled the vast new continent of America. Over the next 200 years, numerous European countries eagerly established their own colonies across these newly discovered lands. These powerful states fiercely contended, often engaging in active struggles for control over new territories and valuable resources. Conflicts were not uncommon, as colonizers battled both each other and the indigenous populations of the continent. A significant shift occurred in 1763 when France, defeated by Britain in the Seven Years' War, surrendered its North American territories. The British colonies proved immensely profitable, largely due to a complex system known as the triangular trade. This trade involved the brutal capture or purchase of African people, who were then transported to America as slaves. There, these enslaved individuals provided the essential labor for producing goods that were subsequently traded back in Europe. While formally answerable to the British Crown, these colonies in practice enjoyed considerable autonomy and their own governing bodies. However, by the late 18th century, tensions between colonial inhabitants and European authorities began to escalate sharply. The British Parliament started imposing new taxes on the colonists, which immediately sparked widespread protests and defiance. Lacking any representation within the British Parliament, the colonial population resolutely refused to pay these new taxes. This simmering discontent culminated dramatically on December 16, 1773, with the iconic Boston Tea Party protest. During the Boston Tea Party, protesters, disguised as Native Americans, dramatically dumped East India Company tea from merchant ships into the harbor. This act of defiance was a direct response to the 1773 Tea Act, which unfairly granted a monopoly on tea sales to a single company in the American colonies. The local population was outraged by this move, feeling their economic freedoms were being severely curtailed by British policy. In retaliation, the British Parliament swiftly enacted 5 laws designed to tighten Britain's administrative control over the colonies. These punitive measures were swiftly dubbed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, further fueling their resentment towards the Crown. In 1774, the First Continental Congress convened, where a petition was drafted and sent to King George II, demanding the repeal of these oppressive laws. However, Britain responded by only intensifying its harsh policies against the colonies, hardening its stance even further. This unyielding approach ignited strong separatist sentiments among the American colonies, who now sought to break away from Great Britain entirely. The 13 colonies united their forces, establishing a continental army to actively resist British authority and fight for their independence. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress formally issued the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America. What began as a rebellion of 13 colonies soon escalated into a full-scale war of independence, also known as the American Revolution. George Washington was appointed as the commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army, leading the fight for freedom. In 1778, France officially entered the war, siding with the United States with the strategic aim of weakening its long-standing rival Britain. Later, the Spanish Empire and the Netherlands also joined the American cause, forming a formidable alliance against the British. The extensive military engagements against so many adversaries severely depleted Britain's resources, ultimately compelling King George II to relinquish his claims over the colonies. On November 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally concluding the war and recognizing the colonies' independence. As part of the agreement, Great Britain also ceded vast territories to the new nation, extending all the way to the Mississippi River. Just a few years later, on September 17, 1787, the United States of America officially adopted its foundational constitution. This landmark document meticulously established a strict division of governmental authority into 3 distinct branches. The legislative branch was embodied by Congress, while judicial power resided with the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the executive authority, essentially the government, was placed under the leadership of a president. With this structure in place, the United States officially emerged as a federal republic. In 1789, the esteemed General George Washington, who led the Continental Army, was elected as the nation's very first president. Following his passing, countless geographical locations, including the nation's capital, were named in his honor. This nascent nation still faced a long and challenging journey, before it would transform into the powerful entity we recognize today. American history is marked by numerous conflicts. The country frequently engaged in wars with its neighbors and participated in global disputes. Yet, among all these struggles, the Civil War stands as the most devastating and bloodiest conflict in all of American history. By the mid-19th century, a multitude of profound issues and disagreements had accumulated, ultimately fracturing the U.S. into two opposing factions: the North and the South. The northern states, with their temperate climate, were largely unsuitable for extensive agriculture. Their economy thrived on industry, populated by free immigrants. In stark contrast, the South boasted a climate ideal for agriculture, which formed the region's economic backbone, supported by wealthy planters, descendants of European aristocrats, who imported enslaved people. These circumstances significantly intensified the economic, political, and social divisions already present between the North and South. Over time, Southerners recognized the advantage of trading directly with European nations, bypassing Northern intermediaries. However, the central government in the North began imposing tariffs and duties on European trade to safeguard its own burgeoning industries. This protective economic stance naturally drew strong objections and resentment from the Southern states. Another crucial factor contributing to the impending conflict was the deeply contentious issue of slavery itself. Africans were forcibly brought to the United States and subjected to slavery, compelled to work fields, serve as domestics, or endure other forms of exploitation. Southern slave owners vehemently opposed abolitionism, the growing movement advocating for the emancipation of black people. Conversely, the northern states sought a workforce of free laborers and therefore stood against the institution of slavery. They viewed slave labor as inefficient and unsuitable for the development of their industrial economy. From these underlying economic disputes, numerous political problems inevitably arose between the regions. In the South, a substantial segment of the population consisted of black slaves who were completely denied the right to vote. Despite this, Southerners resisted any attempts by the Northern federal government to dictate their internal affairs, asserting states' rights. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency as a Republican, a party opposing both slavery and direct Southern trade with Europe. Fearing federal imposition of its will across the entire nation, 6 slaveholding states promptly seceded from the Union. While the U.S. Constitution offered no explicit permission or prohibition for secession, these breakaway territories formed their own government on February 4, 1861, a month before Lincoln took office. In that same pivotal year, the Confederacy formally adopted its own constitution and elected Jefferson Davis as its first president. Notably, Davis assumed his presidential duties even before Abraham Lincoln officially took office in Washington. The brewing conflict soon escalated into open armed confrontation, marking a tragic turn for the divided nation. Actual hostilities commenced on April 12, 1861, igniting the long-feared war between North and South. Following the Confederate forces' capture of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln swiftly declared the Southern states to be in rebellion. He then issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to join the Union Army, though mandatory conscription eventually became necessary. This escalation prompted several previously wavering states to also declare their secession from the Union. The Confederacy, too, initially sought volunteers, but later had to enforce its own law for compulsory military service. Moving forward in history, the Soviet Union played a decisive role in securing victory during the Second World War. This triumph significantly elevated the nation's international standing, underscored by its permanent seat and veto power in the UN Security Council. However, as we've previously touched upon, the bourgeois governments in Western nations harbored deep anxieties about the spread of Soviet influence. These fears had persisted ever since the Bolsheviks first seized power, shaping their foreign policy for decades. This persistent apprehension ultimately led to the formation of two distinct and opposing global blocs. As you might infer, our discussion today will pivot to the complex and prolonged period known as the Cold War. Indeed, as early as April 1945, Sir Winston Churchill ordered his chiefs of staff to plan a surprise strike against the USSR, an operation deemed unthinkable. Western nations finally understood that military force could not vanquish the USSR. Hitler's devastating failure served as a compelling and undeniable lesson of this reality. The confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States unfolded without direct armed clashes. This absence of overt conflict is precisely why it was termed the Cold War. This Cold War, of course, arose from several profound underlying causes. The world had become bipolar, with capitalist and socialist adherents vying for global influence. Secondly, both sides felt an urgent need for cohesion against the perceived threat from their opposing bloc. Thirdly, there was a mutual ambition to secure a decisive advantage in case of a potential Third World War. Churchill's Fulton speech in 1946 is widely considered the formal catalyst for the conflict. He proposed that capitalist nations must unite to counter the rising influence of socialism. This impactful address significantly intensified international relations and global tensions. On March 12, 1947, the Truman Doctrine was declared, establishing a worldwide containment policy against the USSR. Consequently, vast sums amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars were provided to Greece and Turkey under the guise of combating the communist threat. From the late 1940s to 1957, a powerful social movement called McCarthyism took hold in the United States. This period saw a dramatic surge in anti-communist sentiment and severe political repression targeting perceived communists and disloyal citizens. Justifying their actions with the Red Scare, McCarthyists also targeted liberal intellectuals, labor unions, and any policy advocating negotiation with socialist nations. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union simultaneously waged its own campaigns against dissidents and a perceived threat of cosmopolitanism. Such was a sweeping political initiative between 1948 and 1953, designed to suppress skeptical or pro-Western tendencies among Soviet intellectuals, branding them as unpatriotic. Within the broader context of the Cold War, the world began to solidify into distinct socialist and capitalist geopolitical blocs. By 1949, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, CMEA, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, were established, with NATO pooling the capitalist bloc's military resources. Global bipolarity was further cemented in 1955 with the creation of the Warsaw Pact, a military-political alliance spearheaded by the USSR. Throughout this era, communist and capitalist ideologies fiercely competed for influence across numerous countries around the globe. Although direct armed clashes between the United States and the Soviet Union were largely avoided, the period was marked by hybrid warfare and localized conflicts. In the mid-1960s, the United States committed its military forces to the distant jungles of Vietnam. The resulting prolonged conflict and widespread public protests had a profound and lasting impact on American society. Vietnam, a small nation situated in Southeast Asia on the Indo-Chinese peninsula, had a complex history of foreign domination. Originally a French colony, it was later occupied by Japan during World War II, finally achieving independence from foreign powers in 1945. Yet, this newfound freedom was abruptly challenged when France asserted, "Are you aware you're still my colony?" provoking a bewildered response. The French declaration immediately ignited the First Indochina War, further complicating the region's precarious post-war situation. With the Cold War already in full swing, both the United States and the USSR quickly became involved, leading to Vietnam's division into a Soviet/Chinese-backed North and a US-supported South. By 1960, a pro-communist guerrilla movement, known as the Viet Cong, had been established in the southern part of Vietnam. To supply these insurgents, North Vietnam encroached into neighboring Laos, forging the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, named after their leader. Meanwhile, within the United States government, the notion of deploying troops to assist South Vietnam was gaining traction. Both officials and the media propagated the domino effect theory, warning that a communist takeover of Vietnam would turn all of Indochina and Asia red. In 1964, U.S. President Lyndon Johnson secured authorization to deploy the nation's armed forces throughout Indochina. This significant decision was prompted by several alleged clashes between American ships and North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. To this day, the precise details of what transpired remain unclear. Yet the United States proceeded to mobilize its military forces. On March 2, 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder commenced, unleashing a massive aerial bombing campaign against North Vietnam by U.S. air forces. This protracted and exceptionally brutal operation deliberately targeted and destroyed civilian infrastructure as well as military sites. The American military also employed a distinctive incendiary substance, napalm, in its strategic operations. Beginning March 8th, American ground troops began deploying to Vietnam, reaching over 100,000 by year-end and peaking at 500,000 personnel. Both volunteers and draftees were sent to the conflict, as conscription was still actively enforced in the US at that time. The government initially anticipated a swift and straightforward victory, but the reality of the situation proved far more complex. The impenetrable Vietnamese jungles and persistent guerrilla tactics severely hampered American forces from making confident progress, causing the war to drag on. Gradually, public disappointment and dissatisfaction began to mount, as information about the conflict slowly started to filter through American media outlets. Over time, American media outlets began exposing information about alleged U.S. Army war crimes, with graphic footage of the conflict reaching global audiences. Consequently, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, the anti-war movement in the United States gained significant momentum. This burgeoning movement included students facing conscription, prominent public figures, racial minority groups, and even disillusioned veterans returning from the war. Authorities often dispersed these demonstrations violently, labeling protesters as traitors and communist sympathizers. Such heavy-handed government tactics and brutal crackdowns only intensified public outrage and further fueled dissatisfaction. In 1967, a powerful demonstration saw approximately 100,000 people march from downtown Washington to the Pentagon, demanding an end to conscription and the war. While symbolic, this impactful event was merely one of many, and certainly not the largest anti-war protest that would take place. Simultaneously, the condition and morale within the American armed forces were significantly deteriorating. Many soldiers no longer understood their purpose in the conflict, questioning its seemingly endless duration and objectives. This widespread disillusionment led to a sharp increase in desertions and instances where soldiers refused to carry out combat missions. In early 1968, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive coordinated offensive across all fronts, known as the Tet Offensive. Though the U.S. Army successfully repelled the attack, inflicting a tactical defeat on the communists, its unexpected scale profoundly shook both the military and the public. This offensive contradicted official assurances of imminent victory, shattering public confidence and deepening widespread skepticism about the war's progress. A monumental display of dissent occurred on October 15, 1969, when around 15 million Americans participated simultaneously in anti-war actions and a nationwide strike. By the 1970s, an overwhelming majority of citizens desired an end to the war and the safe return of their soldiers, although a significant faction still wished to see the conflict through. The incoming U.S. President, Richard Nixon, pledged to bring about peace with honor for the nation. While the public persistently demanded a complete troop withdrawal, President Nixon was keen to maintain his political support. These complex factors, combined with battlefield setbacks and a worsening economy, ultimately led to the decision to pull out armed forces. Following a peace agreement in 1973, the U.S. military finally departed Vietnam without achieving its goal of containing communism. Shortly after the American withdrawal, North Vietnamese forces swiftly overran and captured the South. For many, the Vietnam War remains a deeply regrettable and shameful chapter in American history. Over 2.5 million Americans served in the combat operations throughout the conflict. The nation tragically lost more than 58,000 soldiers who were killed in action. The total human cost of this devastating war, however, amounted to millions of lives. Many returning service members struggled with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, a lasting wound from their experiences. Vietnam profoundly scarred American society, becoming a national trauma that subsequently permeated popular culture. Beyond Vietnam, communists and capitalists engaged in a global struggle for influence across various nations. While direct military clashes between the US and USSR were avoided, proxy conflicts and hybrid wars became common. An early major confrontation was the 1948-49 Soviet blockade of rail and road access to West Berlin. This First Berlin crisis ultimately led to Germany's division in 1949 into West Germany, FRG, and East Germany, GDR. Soon after, on October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed, as the Communist Party secured power over the Kuomintang, significantly aided by the USSR. Yet, by 1960, relations between the Soviet Union and China fractured, primarily due to Mao Zedong's disapproval of Nikita Khrushchev's revisionist policies. Concurrently, throughout the 1950s, a brutal war erupted on the Korean Peninsula, aiming for national reunification, with the USSR backing the Communist North and the US supporting the capitalist South. Despite immense bloodshed, This protracted conflict ultimately failed to achieve its goal of a united Korean peninsula. In 1961, Nikita Khrushchev issued a significant demand to U.S. President John F. Kennedy concerning West Berlin's status. The Soviet Union was wary of Western intelligence activities and the continuous brain drain of its citizens migrating to the West. Consequently, the infamous Berlin Wall was constructed, a powerful symbol still recognized today and a subject of much creative expression. Just a year later, in October 1962, the world plunged into the Cuban Missile Crisis, widely regarded as the most critical moment of the Cold War. Following the placement of U.S. missiles in Turkey, the USSR deployed its own in Cuba, prompting a U.S. naval blockade against the island nation. The crisis was defused when the USSR agreed to remove its Cuban missiles, and the U.S. reciprocated by lifting the blockade and withdrawing its missiles from Turkey. The global struggle continued as the Vietnam War began in 1964, dividing the country into North, backed by USSR, China, and South, supported by U.S. NATO. This prolonged conflict ended with the withdrawal of U.S. forces and a victory for North Vietnam, which subsequently unified the nation under communist rule. However, the Cold War wasn't always defined by such aggressive confrontations. Periods of détente, or a lessening of tensions, occasionally emerged. A prime example was the 1975 joint Apollo-Soyuz space mission, and that same year also saw the significant Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. However, a new flashpoint ignited in 1979 when the USSR deployed troops into Afghanistan, aiming to assist. This intervention aimed to support a friendly nation against the Mujahideen and secure the Soviet Union's state borders. However, the United States viewed this move with deep disapproval, leading to the non-ratification of the SALT II treaty that very year. The tensions escalated further when the U.S. boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games held in Moscow. A few years later, in 1983, President Ronald Reagan famously labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire, intensifying the rhetoric. A significant shift occurred in 1985 with Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in the USSR, who introduced his concept of new political thinking. Gorbachev championed the idea that universal human values should take precedence over class-based ideologies, a policy that continues to spark debate. This new approach paved the way for a crucial Geneva meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan in 1985, setting a new course for potential cooperation. By 1987, a landmark treaty was signed by the USSR and the US, committing to the elimination of intermediate and short-range nuclear missiles. The years 1988 to 1989 saw the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, followed by their departure from Warsaw Pact nations in 1989. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union normalized its relations with China, and the iconic Berlin Wall finally fell, symbolizing a monumental shift. In 1990, Gorbachev gave his assent to the reunification of Germany, a move that reshaped the European political landscape. Then, on November 21, 1990, the Paris Charter was signed by 32 countries, officially ending decades of confrontation and ushering in an era of peace and unity. The final structural changes came in 1991 with the dissolution of Comecon and the Warsaw Pact, dismantling the Cold War's institutional pillars. Ultimately, a joint declaration signed by Russia and the United States at Camp David on February 1, 1992, formally marked the end of the Cold War. This historic conclusion brought a half-century of ideological struggle to a close. Share in the comments which specific Cold War conflicts you'd like us to explore next.